Hi, everyone. Welcome to another video here on YouTube. We've been sporadic in posting content, but I recently stumbled upon a great book after meeting our guest today on the program, Jason Steinhauer, at a mutual friend's birthday party earlier this year, Carrie Sheffield, who was most recently working with me at Independent Women's Forum. Now she's left to go on to greater opportunities, but will still stay with us. But I connected with Jason at her birthday party, much like you do at any DC area function. And he sent me his book. I read it and it was really interesting. As someone who has studied history, I look to history for my political commentary, and I often defer to history too in many cases. And he writes an interesting book about kind of the internal battle about how history is interpreted, who interprets history, how it's communicated, if it's diluted and not. And so Jason will talk about that today. Thank you so much for speaking with me. It's good to catch up.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Any friend of Carrie's is a friend of mine.
Talk about your professional background for my listeners and viewers and what led you to take an interest in history before we go into your book.
Yeah, so I'll try to keep it brief. The world of professional history is subdivided into two major camps: academic history and public history. Now, academic history, pretty self-explanatory: professors inside universities, teaching courses, mentoring students, writing scholarly journal articles. Public history developed in the 1970s, and it basically emerged from people who worked in museums, archives, libraries, historical societies, even state history offices, who basically said that, the concerns of academia, while relevant to us, don't really fully encapsulate what we do, because we're not teaching all the time in classrooms. We're not always writing scholarly articles. We're creating museum exhibits, and we're doing educational materials, and we're providing interpretive tours for people. So public history sort of emerged as this wing of the profession that really focused on those aspects of doing publicly engaged history work and reaching public audiences with historical information. And that's the world that I came out of. I began my career in museums. I used to work at a Holocaust museum called the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in New York City. I then transitioned into doing archives and curatorial work for a number of different museums, including the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the New York Historical Society, New York Public Library. I eventually found myself at the Library of Congress, which is actually where this background is. I worked for the Veterans History Project at the library, collecting the stories of America's war veterans. And then I went to the John W. Kluge Center, which brings scholars from around the world to research in the library's collections. And from there, I became the founding director of an academic center called the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest. And finally, I'm now a global fellow at the Wilson Center and author of this book, History Disrupted. So my whole career has been in the space of thinking about how public audiences consume historical information and interact with historical information, and how that shapes their perceptions about the past.
Could you briefly summarize the premise and kind of your findings for History Disrupted? You go into kind of an examination of what you call professional history and what you are classifying as this emerging type of history called e-history. So could you break that down and explain what that struggle is between those two thoughts?
Yeah, so when I worked at the library, I began to realize that people were coming to history institutions with their ideas already about history, already pretty fully formed, and that a lot of that formation was happening online and on social media platforms. This was in the 2010s. And so I began to look into this, and I said, there's a phenomenon here, right? We've talked about how social media has shaped our journalism, has shaped our politics, has shaped activism, has shaped even the way we date and live other aspects of our lives. But no one had really looked at how how social media, shapes what we know about the past. And I was seeing this in my everyday interactions with visitors. I was seeing it in my interaction with policymakers on Capitol Hill. So I wanted to look into it further. And that exploration led me to realize that there was a book here. And so the result of that is this book, History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past, which came out earlier this year. And the book tries to figure out, like, what is the sum effect of all of this historical information being communicated online? And there are literally billions and billions of posts about history across all the major platforms, whether it's YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. And anyone who's watching this video has encountered historical information on social media, even if you don't realize it. So as I began to dig into this question, one thing emerged, which was is there any sort of like unifying concept to all this stuff? We're talking about billions of posts across multiple platforms, across multiple time periods on multiple subjects. Is there anything that really unifies all of this? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that actually there should be a name for all this stuff. And that name that I coined in the book is e-history. So basically, e-history is this historical content that we encounter on social platforms. And there are two distinguishing factors for e-history. One is the place that it occurs in a digital environment online. But the second aspect of it is the attempt to leverage the social web and the mechanics of the web in order to achieve visibility. So let me just break that down real quick because it's a little confusing. So basically, there's no point in putting something up on social media unless you want people to see it, right? And so that applies to history content. The more history content gets seen, or a particular piece of history content gets seen online, the more influential it becomes. So then the question becomes, well, how do you get it seen? How do you leverage the mechanics of the social web in order to achieve visibility? And I realized when researching the book that there are actually some pretty tried and true tested methods for getting historical information seen online, and that so much of e-history, billions of posts across all these platforms, adhere to these formulas. And so if you understand these formulas, you then understand why certain pieces of historical information online become visible to you and others do not. And that is sort of encompassed in the definition of e-history. And the aha moment in the book, the surprise that I found when researching the book, was that the more that a piece of e-history, the more that a piece of content on the social web about the past adheres to the fundamental values of the web itself, the more likely it is to get seen. And so that applies consistently across platforms, across time periods, across historical subjects. It led me to conclude at the end of the book that all of this content about history online is not actually improving people's understandings of history at all. What it's doing is it's further embedding the values of the social web deeper into our lives. So in other words, the more we use the technology, the more the technology's values become our values. We don't necessarily learn anything from the technology, but the technology's values become our values. And that is what's happening with e-history and professional history.
Do you think, going off of these findings, that professional historians are starting to use social media? I think you alluded to it in the book, that they recognize, that historians recognize that they need to engage on social media, perhaps to not dilute the different principles and the different findings there. Are they recognizing they need to go on there because some other disseminators who may not have historian backgrounds could dilute historical facts and historical events?
Yeah, so professional historians have been on social platforms since the inception of social platforms, and I actually start with Wikipedia in my book. I consider that to be a social media platform, and historians were contributing and writing about social media in the early 2000s. So it's not as if historians haven't been on these platforms. However, what's interesting is that oftentimes it's very difficult for historians who are on these platforms to achieve visibility. Mm-hmm. And again, going back to e-history, the point of creating e-history on social media is to achieve visibility. And if you're not visible, you're not influential. And so what has happened over time, I argue in the book, is that the web has actually disrupted professional history by making it less visible and less relevant to people's lives, because it's so difficult for professional historians to achieve visibility online. Whereas these other actors that you mentioned, and that can include journalists, it can include conspiracy theorists, it can include disinformation agents, are much better at achieving visibility online, and therefore their content about the past becomes more influential. So in part, this book is a little bit of a call to professional historians to recognize some of these tactics that are used to make professional history visible and influential online by other actors, and to see if historians could actually learn from that to find ways to leverage some of the mechanics of the social web to gain more influence online.
I've noticed recently, as we go into the midterm elections, and I'm not asking you to pontificate or anything, but I've seen a lot of historical metaphors being applied to domestic politics. And for me, that kind of rubs me the wrong way. And I think a lot of regular people, even people in the middle, kind of see that and they're like, okay, why are they applying this historical metaphor to something that has no bearing to that conversation? How do historians sometimes feel about lofty let's say, metaphors being applied to, let's say, economics or inflation or trending topics. Does that kind of concern historians?
Well, I won't speak for all historians. I'll just speak for myself. I would say that the analogies we choose tell a lot about what we're trying to achieve, right? And so the analogies that we choose in and of themselves have agendas, which is why a lot of historians, though I won't speak for all, and including myself, don't like to rely on analogies. Analogies are kind of like a little bit of like a cheat code for history, right? It's like, well, I don't really know too much about this thing, but it sounds kind of similar to this other thing that happened. So let me just pull that other thing that happened to try to make a point about the present or to score a political point in an argument or something like that. And, that I think tells you more about the present and about the person making the argument than it does teach you anything about the past. So I think what I always strive for in the work that I do is for people to have a deeper understanding of what actually happened in the past. And it's only once you have that deeper understanding that is nuanced, that is complex, that weighs lots of different factors, that you can actually even begin to make some conclusions or draw some lines to the present. But I think part of what I talk about in the book is that the speed of communication on these platforms is so fast, and the sort of media narrative moves so quickly that oftentimes people will grab pieces of the past and just inject them into political arguments where they may or may not have any relevance, just for the purpose of being able to contribute, right? Because if you contribute, that leads to visibility, and visibility leads to influence. Mm-hmm. So you're not really learning anything about the past. You're not really studying the past. What you're doing is you're weaponizing the past or utilizing the past as a means to score political points in the present, or to advance a particular agenda, whether it is a commercial agenda, a political agenda, or even a personal agenda for more attention or more invites to speaking gigs or more invitations to come on podcasts and pretend like you know something. And so that is a lot of how the past gets utilized in these fast-moving political debates. It happens on all the platforms: Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, even Wikipedia.
Yeah, and you go on in your book to discuss, obviously, Wikipedia, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. And I don't recall if you touched, I can't recall if you touched on TikTok that much or dedicated a chapter. But before we were recording this, I had noted to you that Pew Research Center has kind of compiled data on social media becoming an aggregate for news absorption. And I have no doubt it's also for understanding historical context too. And TikTok now has emerged as one of the leading sources of people obtaining news. And I bet that extends also to history. Do you have any thoughts into that? Do you think history could be further diluted through a medium such as TikTok as well, much like it has in these kind of legacy social media platforms?
So one of the things I've done on the heels of this book is create something called the History Communication Institute to look at these questions more closely. And the History Communication Institute, HCI, is at the time of the recording of this podcast about to release a report about TikTok. So we've been looking into this, and we'll have a little bit more to say once the report comes out, but I'll offer some broad statements here. First of all, there are more than 53 billion, with a B, billion posts on TikTok with the hashtag of history. So 53 billion posts on TikTok with the hashtag of history. So to your point, yes, history is being discussed on TikTok, and it's not solely being discussed by historians. In fact, many professional historians and many professional history institutions are not even on TikTok and don't really understand how it works. It's oftentimes conversations that are being driven by other actors, and sometimes that can be positive and sometimes that can be negative. With 53 billion posts, right, you're going to get a lot of both and everything in between. One thing I found in my book, though, which did not really look at TikTok, because the book kind of goes from 2001 to 2021, and I only get the TikTok at the very end of that. But what I've noticed on TikTok is that some of the tropes that appeared on earlier platforms are now migrating to TikTok. So what do I mean by that? Well, basically, over time, social media itself, the platforms and the user bases, have taught history communicators what works and what doesn't when it comes to communicating about history. It turns out that things like surprising people with historical facts that they may not have known works really well to achieve visibility online. And so what you get are these string of accounts that promise you hidden histories or surprising histories, or the history you didn't know, or the history you didn't learn in school. You're probably familiar with these because you've probably seen them. right? And so it turned out those worked really well on Twitter and on YouTube and on Reddit and on other channels. So what's happened is that that format has just migrated to TikTok. And so what you find on TikTok is you find a lot of people creating these sort of hidden history, you didn't know this, but this is true kind of thing. And it winds up becoming very sensational, and it winds up becoming very exaggerated and simplified. And that's the type of history that people get. They don't get nuanced complexity with history on TikTok. They get the stuff that's proven to work on social media and that adheres to the values of social media, because that rewards people with visibility. So we're seeing some of the same patterns and the same trends from earlier platforms replicate themselves on TikTok, at least when it comes to history content.
I look forward to reading that report. And when that does come out, please send it to me, because I think my listeners and followers would be interested to see that, especially paired with that study about how people are absorbing information largely on TikTok now. But aside from these reports, the center that you've started, what else are you doing to educate people about history, or rather reigniting an interest in history?
Well, I think part of it is just becoming more visible. Again, we talked about how much weight we give to visibility, but you'd be amazed at how many people I've spoken to over the past year who say, you're the first historian I've ever met, or you're the first historian I've ever talked to, especially once you get outside of DC or New York. You hear this a lot. I think for a long time, and this is not to fault historians in any way, this is just part of the work of being a historian, right? You spend a lot of time researching, you spend a lot of time in the archives, you spend a lot of time in the classroom, and it's difficult to then find time to go out and do speaking gigs or come on podcasts like this. So I think we need to make history and historians just more visible and show people different faces, right? Show people that you don't have to necessarily look a certain way or be a certain gender or have a certain skin color to be a historian. We need to diversify the profession. We need to show younger faces, fresher faces, different types of scholarship. We need to show students at the high school and college level that it's interesting and important and cool to be a historian, and that studying history actually matters to political debates, to journalism, to our understanding of world affairs, and that a large, diverse group of people can be historians and can have rewarding and successful careers while doing so. So I've been doing a lot of speaking engagements. I've been traveling to across US and Europe. I've been writing, and I've been doing things like this because I think we need to get historians out there more. We need to talk about history in new ways. We need to really demonstrate why history and historical understanding that's nuanced and complex actually helps you understand the world, helps you do your job, helps you be a better citizen. And those are all the things that I think the History Communication Institute can work on.
Where could viewers find your book, read more about your scholarship? I also want you to plug in your Substack. I like getting that too, where they can find your musings and how they can connect with you. So dispense all the links if you can.
All right. So I'm very easily Googleable. If you put Jason Steinhauer into the web, you will find all kinds of things. I have a website, jasonsteinhauer.com. I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter at Jason Steinhauer. And as you kindly mentioned, I do write a newsletter where I update things about the book, but I also talk about how history shows up in our everyday lives. I've just wrote recently about history on Broadway. I've written about history in politics. I've written about the European Union's relationship with the United States and how history factors into that. And so if that stuff sounds interesting to you, then please do sign up, jasonsteinhauer.substack.com. And you'll also get updates about other stuff that the Institute is going to be doing moving forward. I will say the HCI at the moment has been a little bit of a slow starting project, only because I've been so busy traveling and doing talks and stuff. But starting in 2023, really going to be taking the HCI to a new level, thinking about new ways to communicate history, new ways to infuse historical understanding into public discourse. And it's going to be crucially important that we understand our history as we head into the 2024 presidential election and the 2026 semi-sesquicentennial of the United States, 250th anniversary of the US. So we need history in the public conversation now more than ever. So I hope that everyone here will connect with me and get on board with this.
I will encourage them to do so, because I hear from a lot of people who say, you know, when I talk about my own family history and the region of the world where my parents come from, about how come we didn't know about Eastern Europe and what happened behind the Iron Curtain in these little countries. And I know even for American history, people are discovering different things, and all over the world, not just the US, but Europe. Asia, Africa, and then some. So people do have a curiosity, even though public polling shows that people are misunderstanding or not understanding of different historical events, or they're losing sight of horrors that happened in history, like the Holocaust. Same with the communist horrors of Stalin and other dictators as well. So I think there is a need, and people in your profession do have a duty to talk about historical events and get people to be educated. So I really appreciate you coming on and talking about your book and your findings.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I'm so glad that we met and that we're in touch. So I'm looking forward to future conversations with you.
Absolutely.